Hello and welcome to another session of Karen's Colours. I'm Dr. Karen and these are my colour conversations. In this session we're going to be examining how one constructs the grey personality. This is a continuation of the information on grey that I gave about a month ago. If you'd like to go back and have a look at that video, you're most welcome. The grey personality is an interesting one in that it is an enigma in itself. And one of the features of the grey personality is that it is extremely rare. But before I get started, I'd like once again to welcome back those of you who have been following this series of videos. I hope that the colour information I give you about the various different types of personalities has helped you in understanding both yourself and also those around you. If you are new to these videos, then by all means you are very welcome. You might like to like the video, you might even like to subscribe to it. That's always helpful because it allows the algorithm to recognize that there is some value in what I'm presenting. So let's get started in deconstructing the grey personality. An overview of this session will include the following items. Firstly, we're going to examine very briefly the history and importance of grey as a basic colour term. Then we're going to look at how the personality of a grey person arises and where it arises. In this case, it is in late childhood, early adolescence. The feedback and experiences that an individual has will determine the type of grey response they then have in later life. And the stress responses, which we've been using as the basis for examining these colour personalities, will be revised. And in particular, the black and white links are very important for this particular system. And finally, we're going to have a brief look at the politics of grey, because grey itself has some various peculiar and also some very common associations. To begin with, let's examine our little mannequin. We know from previous videos that black and white are the basis of all personality formation. That is a tendency towards extroversion and introversion, depending on the types of early babyhood experiences that we have. The next personality that emerges is red, which is all about survival and about the power of the word no in particular. Then we have yellow, which is all about learning and experience as we learn to wander around our environments and to taste it, touch it, smell it, and otherwise interact with it. And then we have green, which is all about developing values. These are the restrictions that we experience as we're growing up. For blue, we then learn all about shared meanings, what certain experiences and feelings and other associations have for other people, as well as those that we then learn to accommodate for that particular colour personality. Brown we haven't touched on yet, and I'm going to leave brown until the very end because it is a composite of all of the colours and therefore quite complex to discuss. But we already have examined one of those colour personalities that emerges in late childhood, early adolescence, that comes from a spontaneous eruption of that colour meaning within our psyche. For orange, it's all about social skills. The one we're looking at today, of course, is grey. And I will note that grey, although I use the English spelling, which is G-R-E-Y, the Americans spell it G-R-A-Y. And the two are synonymous. So please don't assume that I have made a misspelling. There are two others in the lexicon, possibly three if we include the colour cyan, and we'll be looking at those in later videos. All right. Let's begin with the history of grey as a basic colour term. If you want to know more about it, then the video that I did about a month ago called Grey, Elegance or Dross will give you an in-depth analysis of the history of how grey became a colour word in our language. It also describes a lot of the idioms associated with that colour. Grey was named basically for aged objects, whether those objects embody solidarity, strength and permanence, such as buildings, statues and other structures that are meant to be monumental, or whether it has to do with longevity in either humans or other life forms. Grey is all about aging. Grey has some specific sorts of characteristics that we associate with it, and these arise from the fact that grey exists partway between black and white. We have darker greys, we have lighter greys, and we have mid-greys. We also have greys associated with other hues, and we'll be examining those shortly. Grey itself does not exist in the colour wheel. And because of this, it is also rarely a best-loved colour. It doesn't appear as something that attracts our attention, and so we don't particularly like it as a colour. You can also have a look at the video Becoming Black or White, which underpins most of the information that occurs in grey. Because of grey's unique position in between the colours black and white, it's important to understand the underpinnings of how a black or a white personality are formed in order to understand how one becomes a middle personality, somewhere in between those two extremes. Our first issue is examining grey as a hue, as a colour in its own right. Grey will darken any colour, and the more grey there is in a colour, the darker that colour becomes. So we find that the saturated colours, that is those that are brightest, will retain some dominance even when you approach it with a lot of grey. We can still see some part of the underlying colour. On the other hand, unsaturated hues tend to blend with other hues. So we find that pale blues and cyans are very similar in their coloration when grey is added to them. Similarly, red and pink and purple have commonalities in those unsaturated hues. Orange and brown, of course, are classic examples in that it's very difficult to differentiate between pale oranges and pale browns. What is of importance is that the darker the hue, the more negative the connotations associated with that particular colour that underpins the greyed form. The grey associations themselves are also quite varied. Grey epitomises neutrality. It is a colour that is colourless. It envisages ideas of conformity. There is not much difference between a light grey and a dark grey, and in terms of personality, conformity is an underpinning idea. It's also associated with boredom. There's nothing exciting about greys that makes it appealing for us as children. It envisages uncertainty. We're not sure, is this grey a pure grey or is it a grey that has an underpinning hue attached to it? It offers misdirection. We don't know exactly where that grey is going to take us. And like Escher's staircases behind us, greys can move in any direction. It also associates with indifference. We don't care what grey means because grey doesn't mean anything in particular. It offers deflection. If something is grey, we tend to look away from it to look for other aspects of a particular image. And again, I point to the image of Escher's staircases behind me, where we see the grey as being overwhelming, but what focuses our attention are the dark blacks areas and also the light white areas. And finally, grey has to do with modesty. It has to do with an ability to appear moderate and also profoundly simple in our choices and our values. Grey emerges in late childhood and early adolescence as a personality characteristic. It accompanies the development of critical thinking. In fact, it is tied to mental challenges. What do I mean by those? Mental challenges cause us to have a cautious approach to novel situations. We don't understand what they are, and so therefore we very carefully approach them to understand them better before we make a decision about what we're going to do next. It also envisages experiencing cognitive mismatch. We don't understand something because we don't have a preconceived idea of how to respond to a given situation that is grey, and so we step back and allow that experience to unfold in front of us before we learn to react to it. There is a great deal of confusion and uncertainty associated with this development of critical thinking until such times as we make a decision. There is also a recognition that there is a middle ground associated with almost all experiences. There's no such thing as an absolute black or an absolute white circumstance. There are always grey areas, and those grey areas are the ones that offer confusion and uncertainty, but are also the ones that prevent us from going to extremes in our reactions and responses. While we're developing the grey personality, we are also mentally exploring all the different alternatives that are available to us. And as we do so, we find ourselves engaging with the various distractions that make us reevaluate those experiences. We are linking ideals, that is, the things that we hope will happen, with the reality of what actually is happening. And this causes us often to begin with the what about isms of life. In other words, okay, this might be true, but what about that? It is also true. And so we find ourselves vacillating between one extreme and the other extreme as we try and find our footing in some sort of central position. During adolescence, and particularly late adolescence, that we develop a validation of the grey mindset. We do this by changing our worldview. We're no longer thinking in terms of everything is either good or bad, right or wrong, black or white. Now we know that there are many grey areas and there are many different ways of interpreting any given situation. There is an emphasis on equity. We want to be fair. We want things to be right so that both sides of an extreme equation can be in some way harmonized. It encourages a sense of justice. We know when something is right or wrong, but we also understand the precursors, the ideas that have led to that rightness or that wrongness, and we try and find some middle ground that gives everybody a sense of fair play. This determines a sense of mental openness. We start to develop some benevolence, some altruism. We give our hearts to people. We allow others to receive some of the kindness and the caring that we feel are necessary for their particular situations, and are also the things that we hope for ourselves in return. It promotes empathy and compassion, and also protects against the other types of isms thinking, so that a grey personality has a great deal of difficulty in being racist, in being sexist, in being ageist. These isms are not the types of activities mentally that a grey personality can conceive of easily. They understand that they exist, but they themselves do not normally attach their own behaviours to those particular isms. Grey personalities are formed through stresses just like all the other hue personalities are. And here we find that the feedback determines the type of grey personality that will exist. Reaction control to what experiences a grey personality is exposed to, of course, requires practice. We tend to act either in one extreme or the other because that is how babies react. But by the time we get to adolescence, we now have to learn some sort of mental, emotional, and also physical control. So the grey personality has both positive and negative aspects associated with it. The positive aspect is that the grey personality is often highly intelligent, whereas the negative aspect of that same intelligence is that the person appears fairly uninspired by whatever they are exposed to. There is a control about the positive grey personality that allows them to retain their composure regardless of the situation, whereas the negative aspect is one of total unemotionality. The grey personality is often associated with wisdom, whereas the negative aspect of that wisdom is a rigidity of thinking and acting. The grey personality is considered to have a balanced view on life, whereas the negative aspect of that is indifference to other people's plights, as well as the sorts of situations that they themselves are exposed to. The positive reaction of objectivity is a grey facet, whereas detachment is one that associates with the negative aspects of grey. And then we find that the grey personality is often very reflective. They think carefully about what it is that they have experienced or learnt, whereas the negative aspects of that is isolationism, not wanting to engage, not wanting to be involved. Grey is also associated with a fair degree of sophistication. For that, you'll need to go back to the video I did a month ago on grey, because it describes just how sophistication came to be associated with grey. But it's also associated with boring and bland activities and experiences. So what then are the grey stress responses? As with all stress responses, we have grey as a fight response, which, if you look at the underlying ideas of fight, it's a white response, one that requires action in the real world. And here we find that the positive aspect of the grey fight response is the person who is a wise arbitrator, whereas the negative aspect is a person who is an expert deflector. The wise arbitrator is a seeker of justice, and they will argue both sides of an issue in order to encourage some form of conflict resolution. The expert deflector, on the other hand, is all about being indecisive and resistive to ideas and changes and opportunities. They refuse to learn anything new, and as a result of that, they become deliberately isolationist and quite difficult to move in any direction. Another white-based grey response is fawning. And once again, we have positive and negative aspects. The positive aspect of grey as a fawner is a person who turns out to be a people pleaser. On the other hand, the negative aspect is the vacant mirror. The people pleaser fits in anywhere and everywhere. They're quite happily associated with whatever situation they are involved in. They listen to all sides of an issue and often do so without interjecting their own ideas or values. They also have a great deal of activity in placating other people's emotional states. So they're very good at making people feel better. On the other hand, the vacant mirror person lacks a defined personality. They don't seem to be anybody in particular. They mimic other people's styles and activities and, in fact, seem to have no ideas or values or any way of dealing with life other than imagining themselves to be somebody that they are not. And they are also indecisive and have a lot of slippery interactions that can often hurt people more than they actually make people feel better. The black-based personality characteristics as stress responses are firstly grey as flight. This is all internalized stuff. This is where the person chooses to withdraw inwardly with their personality characteristics and develop some form of ability to avoid an issue. So again, we have positive and negative aspects. The positive grey as flight is the judicious retreater. On the other hand, the negative is the opportunistic grifter. The judicious retreater avoids conflicts. This person will not engage in other people's issues. They choose invisibility. They will stand on the outside of a circle watching the fight rather than engage with it. And they also develop a very pacifist belief system. They are the people who are unlikely to volunteer for anything that is dangerous or demeaning in any way whatsoever, and they're definitely not antagonistic in any form. The opportunistic grifter, on the other hand, has some other very peculiar characteristics. Firstly, they lack any form of moral code. They don't care what other people think about their actions and their behaviors. They just care about how it feels to them in the here and now and what they can achieve out of those particular actions. They refuse all responsibility for their actions. They will not take a role that requires them to become a leader, although they can demand lead, but if something goes wrong, it's never their fault. And they remain unengaged in activities. They tend to procrastinate so that if there is anything that needs to be done, they will expect someone else to do those things rather than do them themselves. And finally, we have the other black characteristic, grey as freeze. The positive aspect of grey as freeze is someone who has emotional stability, whereas the negative aspect is the person who is a fence sitter. The emotionally stable person will stand their ground. They will weigh up the options in front of them before making any decisions or acting upon them, and they are intellectually balanced, so they tend not to fall down on either one side or the other side of a situation or a problem. They will try and find the middle ground every time, and they will not budge until such time as they have found that middle ground. The fence sitter has a similar sort of activity, but firstly, they don't just weigh up the options. They cannot make decisions. They simply will not or cannot decide how to react or how to respond to any given situation, and as such, they tend to be frozen in inactivity. That mental freezing causes them to have a further indifference to the outcomes of whatever the situation is that they are facing. I don't care is a very common saying from someone who is working in the grey stress freeze aspect of stress responses, if they are a fence sitter. By the time the grey personality becomes an adult, we have some fairly standard activities taking place. Grey can be seen as a strength, in which the conscious activity or the conscious position is the activity that is enacted by that person, and the unconscious drive is the motivator that encourages that specific activity. Grey as the obstacle shows us a problem behavior occurring in the real world as a result of unrequited needs that occur in the internal world. And then we have grey as the current challenge. A psychological stressor, the internal world, then comes out as a physical reaction in the external world. Let's examine those in more detail. Grey as a strength can be seen as a person who is thoughtful, intelligent, but also silent. They tend not to push themselves forward. Historically, they've had a basically balanced childhood. Their expectations have been created by understanding that sometimes one thing happens and sometimes something else happens, yet the outcomes are always headed in a direction that enables them to see that both sides of an issue can have merit. They're intellectually industrious. These are children who have a curiosity that extends beyond just simply wanting to explore the environment. They explore, they remember, and they then make decisions based on that exploration and the memories that have accrued. Currently, they tend to present themselves as calm, cautious, and someone who is seeking answers to a particular dilemma. They have an increased awareness of the types of options available to them in any given situation, and there is a limited pressure to choose a direction until such time as all of the options have been examined mentally and a decision made. So they don't tend to jump to conclusions or jump in and respond when a situation arises. That can make them a little bit tardy, but that's okay, because as a strength, it prevents them from being too reactive in any given situation. As an obstacle, things are slightly different. The person is overwhelmed with usually the issues that they're facing. They tend to show a great deal of confusion and indecision. Historically, they've been unsupported. There's been scattered parenting. One time they do something and they're praised for it. The next time they are punished for exactly the same activity. They don't understand where the boundaries are. So therefore they make up the boundaries in any given situation depending on what is most expedient for them at that time. In current issues, the grey as an obstacle is always someone who lacks determination. I can't decide what I want to do. They're emotionally unresponsive. I don't care what you say or what you feel or what you want to know. I don't care. They have limited or no ability to plan ahead, and as such, they have a feeling of being stuck. If the person is grey in the now, then they're often facing indeterminate challenges. They don't know what the future brings, and so therefore they don't know exactly how to respond to it. Positive aspects of facing those challenges is that they are cautious and methodical in their approach to problem solving. The negative aspect is that they become closed off and disinterested in whatever is going on around them. They experience a great deal of confusion. Positively, that confusion is associated with weighing up the options until their value system kicks in and they determine which option is the best in any given circumstance. Whereas the negative of that is a mental paralysis. I can't think, therefore I cannot and will not do. There are some potential health issues associated with grey in the now, and they are all associated with thinking aspects. So there's a dysfunctional cognition. They have an approach avoidance issue. Do I do this? Do I avoid it? Do I get involved? Do I run away? They really are stuck with a foot in both camps and cannot decide which is the more important or the more valuable for themselves. They have a lot of psycho-emotional disengagement. I can't feel, I can't think, I don't want to get involved. And that makes them very suspicious of any help or solutions that are offered by others because they automatically refuse to accept them. They're always looking for the underlying payoff that they will have to give out in order to accept whatever that solution or help might entail. Now, the politics of grey is rather interesting, but it's also fairly limited. For a start, the visibility of the grey determines its use. And as we know, grey being anywhere between black and white, visibility will change according to the intensity of that grey. In business, grey often suggests reliability and solidity in a particular object or a firm. As a status, it can indicate wealth or value. Often, people who are in elite circles will adopt grey as a colour to enhance their other aspects of living and being. But in heraldry, that is, the methods that we use in order to classify our particular allegiances, specifically for flags and countries, it is very limited. It is a colour that doesn't appear very often in the flags of nations. It's a little bit more common in the flags of individual smaller states and cities within those nations, but the nations themselves don't tend to use grey. And if it does appear in any flag, it's usually as an adjunct to emphasise the other colours that are present on that flag. It's adopted in many of the rainbow sexualities, and there are quite a number of different flags that have quite a lot of grey in them. And here are two examples. Gender flux is the one on the left, and grey sexual is the one on the right. Both of those flags have been created using a fair degree of grey as an overarching colour, and both of those are symbolic of a fluctuating or changing gender, aspiration, and also stance. So, what have we learnt out of this? Well, grey is an achromatic basic colour term that links black and white characteristics and falls somewhere in between the two. Preference for grey is a rare phenomenon, and so too the ability to become a grey personality is also fairly rare. Grey as a strength denotes someone who is aiming for fairness and objectivity in all that they do, whereas as an obstacle, it produces procrastination and indecision. If grey is the colour of preference in the now, it indicates confusion and the unknown, which has to be dealt with in order to move forward. Grey health issues always indicate some form of mental and emotional disturbance, and as such can be very, very damaging to the person who is feeling that way. Grey was considered to be fairly apolitical, but it's been adopted by many of the rainbow sexuality. So there we have it. This is the grey personality. I hope you've learnt something from this that makes it easier for you to understand those periods of your life where indecision or procrastination seem to dominate your activities and your way of thinking. We have two more hues in the basic colour term lexicon, that is purple and pink, which I'll be dealing with in the forthcoming months. But I'm also going to be looking at the colour cyan, which doesn't appear in the lexicons yet, but is of importance as well. I hope you'll be joining me for that. In the meantime, may your life be filled with more colours than grey. See you next time. Bye.